Today I'm going to show you what I think is the easiest way to animate DJ logos using the free and open source program Blender. Now this tutorial is aimed for beginners who are quite new to the program or 3D animation in general. So if you're a musician or DJ who just wants an easy, free way to animate their logo, then this is going to be the video for you. I'll be going through the process step by step, explaining basic Blender things in detail. So if you're quite experienced in Blender, you may want to skip ahead. But for beginners, this will be quite helpful as Blender is a deep program that can be quite intimidating for new users. Your end result is going to look something like this with lots of control for variations to suit your preferences. With that out of the way, let's get on with the tutorial. So the first thing you want to do is go to blender.org and download the latest version of Blender. Just make sure you actually go into blender.org and not Blender, because you might get Trojaned. It does happen. So yeah, just make sure you're at the right URL. You should be fine. Now a bit about Blender. It's essentially an open source 3D application which can pretty much be used for anything. As you can see, it could be used for modeling, sculpting, VFX, animation and rigging, story art, 2D and in 3D. And people have even made feature-length films with it. That's how powerful this program is. Yeah, I can't thank the developers enough just for making tools like this accessible for people like me who don't really have the money to be splashing out on expensive software like 3ds Max and Maya. So yeah, massive thanks to the developers. You guys are doing an awesome job. But yeah, with it being such a deep program, it is quite a steep learning curve. So it can take a while to get results that you're proud of. I've been using it for I think nearly 3 years now, and there's probably like 60% of it I've probably not even touched, but I'm still able to get results that I'm proud of. And I'm going to be trying to keep this beginner friendly, so hopefully it's not too intimidating for you. So let's jump into Blender. So once you've got Blender open, you want to just click out of this, and what you have here is pretty much a blank canvas of an open 3D world that you can essentially do whatever you want in. What you're basically doing is creating a world, and the way you get your video result is you create the scene and you start animating it, and you basically just use a camera to film what's going on in the scene, but just replace the word film with rendering. So you just set up your camera to watch the animation and then essentially render out the animation with it, and it will render out whatever's in the camera frame. And you hit 0 to go in and out of camera mode, just so you know. And as this is a tutorial for beginners, I'll just quickly go over how to navigate the viewport. So you want to use the middle mouse button. That's the main one you're going to be using. So if you hold the middle mouse button, that orbits around the center of the scene. If you scroll up, you zoom in, and if you scroll down, you zoom out. And if you hold shift, that changes your orbit point. So that lets you move around the scene like that. And if you want to get your orbit point back to the center, you just click on whatever object is at the center and you hit the period key, the period key basically takes you to the object that you've selected. So let's say you want to go to this camera here, click on the camera, hit the period key, and now you can orbit around the camera. This is really handy if you've got loads of objects in your scene and you're trying to model them from different angles. First thing you want to do is delete the default cube. So just hit X and then delete. Over here we've got our camera, we've got a light here as well. So we're just going to delete the light because we don't need that, but we are going to use the camera. So I want you to click on your camera and just hit Alt G to reset the location, and then Alt R to reset the rotation. Now just hit G again and hit Z. So GZ, and we're going to bring that camera up just so it's perfectly facing down to the center of our scene. Now we're going to hit Shift A and we're going to add a plane. Scale it up a bit, so hit S and 8, just scale it up quite high. And we'll hit 0, so we go into camera mode. And with your camera selected, go to the transform settings here. And we're just going to bring that camera up just until it fits the frame of... Now there are multiple ways you can approach animating DJ logos, but I think the easiest way to do it, for a beginner at least, is just to slap an image texture onto a plane and then basically just animate the plane. Alternate methods that you could use is to actually trace the logo within 3D, but that's a bit more advanced and it's quite time consuming as well, so I wouldn't really recommend that for beginners. And if you're like me, well, because I'm a musician first, I only really got into Blender because I wanted to just, I guess, up my visual branding game a bit. I ended up getting addicted to the program just because it's so fun to play with. But if you're like me at the time, you just wanted to get something done quick, I would advise doing it the way I'm going to show you. So now that we've got our plane, let's get our logo. So you want to grab the logo that you want to work with. It's worth noting that you want your logo to be a 1:1 ratio. This will just make your life much easier when you're applying the texture to the plane. The reason why is because if you have it, let's say you're using this Andy C logo, right? If you use like a wide logo, when you actually apply the logo to the plane, it's gonna stretch out like that because that's just the way the UVs work. You can manually change this with the UV editor, but it's going to be hard to get it to look exactly how the logo looks in terms of proportions. So really with logos, obviously a lot of if you're working with clients, they normally have like brand guidelines, so you want it to be as clean as possible. You don't want to have to be like eyeballing this kind of stuff. It's just going to give you more work is what I'm trying to say. So what I would suggest you do is if you have a logo that's wide, say like this one is 680 by 184, I would just take it into a program like Photoshop, or if you want to keep it open source, of course, you can use a program called GIMP. That's an open source alternative to Photoshop. You can pretty much do the same results. You want to basically make sure it's a 1:1 ratio. So I would go with 1024 by 1024. One other tip as well is make sure that the resolution is a multiple of 2. Your computer will just perform a little bit better if you keep the resolution to a power number. If you want a 1K texture, you do 1024 by 1024. Or to do a 2K texture, you do 2048 by 2048. It's just good practice to always, when you're working with textures in 3D, is just to stick to the power rule. So just making sure everything is basically within those power numbers. So obviously, computers run like 2-bit, 4-bit, 8-bit, 16-bit, 32-bit, 64-bit. So you want to make sure that you're following that pattern. It's not actually too important for this design because this is a fairly simple design. It's not going to be very resource heavy anyway, but this is just good knowledge to bear in mind just going forward when your work does become more complex, or if you decide to get into like game development and stuff like that. This is really important stuff to know, but at least just make sure it's a 1:1 ratio, just because we don't want the image stretching. We'll go with a 1024 by 1024, create that. So let's just load in our texture. And I'm just going to hit Control T just to transform it. I want to give myself just a bit of wiggle room. The camera is going to be filling the whole plane. You don't want the text to be right on the edge, because here's the thing, you can always scale up, right? But if you start scaling down, say you want to bring your text smaller, you're going to have no plane to work with. So just make sure you give yourself a bit of screen real estate, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So yeah, we'll say about there. I'm just going to invert this layer because I want it to be a black text on white background. We'll go to image adjustments and invert. So that's pretty much it. Let's save that. So we're going to export as a PNG. We want it to be a PNG, but we don't want it to be transparent. So just make sure you've got a white background with black text, and we'll export that. Sometimes if you have transparent images, it doesn't really work very well when you're actually shading in 3D, just because a lot of it relies on detecting color values, which obviously alpha channels don't have. So we'll just save that, neb motion 1x1. So we got a flat plane. I'll show you how to actually get the logo on the plane now. So to add the text to the plane, you want to go to the material properties here, and you want to add a new material. We'll just call this text, yeah? And what you want to do is go to the top right corner here, where your cursor turns into a little cross. Just drag that in, and that's going to create a new window for you. And you're going to go to this bit here, this little menu here. We're going to change this to shader editor. And we're going to hit N on the keyboard just to get rid of this menu, because you don't need that. Now what you see here is exactly what you see here. They're just two different ways of doing things, right? So I prefer working in here because it actually gives you a lot more control over what you can do. You're a bit limited to what you can do on here. This is a node-based editor. Basically lets you use these little things called nodes. So this thing is a node, this is a node, and you basically plug things into each other to create your desired result. Grab that image texture that we just created and just pop that in here. Drag that in there, and you just need to plug the color into the color. If you're noticing that you're not seeing any update, the text isn't coming up, that's because the way Blender works is you have different render settings. So this is your preview mode. This has no shading properties in the preview mode. The reason why is because sometimes when you've got a complex scene, shaders can actually slow down your computer. So it's actually better for you to do all your editing in a plain view modes, just so that you can actually speed up your workflow, just so you're not like constantly waiting for shaders to update and calculations to be made with lighting and things like that. So what we're going to do is go into the rendered mode. So I want you to hit the Z and then A. That takes you into rendered mode, and now you can see the text on the plane. It's got this very weird grey hue to it, right? It doesn't look like that black and white texture that we just created. And that's because the way 3D works is it's essentially a world that you're creating where the color is determined by the lighting of the world around it. And by default, Blender's world is set to grey. So we're going to go to the world settings here and we just pop that to black. So there's no lighting in the world. And if you take off the overlays, you'll notice that you can't see anything. And that's obviously because we've removed all the lighting, right? You turn off the light switch and you're not going to be able to see in the room. It's exactly the same kind of thing in Blender or any other 3D application actually. So keep those overlays on for now. What we're going to do is we're going to use emission shading to basically bring those colors in. So we're going to delete this principal BSDF because we don't actually need it, right? It's got way more options than we need. So we're going to delete that. We're going to hit Shift A and we're going to add a shader. We're going to add an emission shader and we're going to plug the emission into the surface of the material output. And now we've got this white plane. And now we're going to plug that image texture back into the color. And that's basically saying that this image is going to feed the color of the emission, right? So now we've got our text logo. And yeah, now you're noticing it's quite pixelated here. So tighten up that resolution is to add a color ramp. So we're going to hit Shift A, go to converter, color ramp, pop that in between. And we're just going to drag in these black values and we'll drag in the white as well. And that should make it a little bit better. Obviously, the higher resolution you work with, the better. I probably should have gone for a 2048 texture, but it's okay. We'll just we'll deal with what we've got. But just in the future, you probably want to go with a higher resolution texture. So probably do 2048 instead of 1028. Now, if you flip these sliders around, you'll get a black background with a white text, and that's the look I want. So I'd advise you to flip them around just so you can get that look. And now if you hit 0 on your camera, this is what we're going to see. So if you take off your overlays, that's what we can see now. So yeah, 0 takes you into camera view mode, and you can actually pump up the emission strength. You can see it's a little dim. You can actually pump this up. If you go over to your render properties, you can add a thing called bloom, and that's going to add a bit of glow. I find the Eevee bloom quite strong. We're using Eevee, by the way. Stick to this render engine because it's the fastest one. It's not as accurate as Cycles, but it is very good for sort of motion graphic work. Cycles is really if you're trying to go for like hyper realism. Eevee is good for sort of quick designs like this. We're going to drop that intensity down on the bloom because I do find it a bit strong, and I think we'll pop the strength to 4. I would also scroll down here and change your color management. I'm going to change that to very high contrast. So we're done with the shading. So we're going to get rid of this. So just go back to the corner that you originally dragged and just going to drag it back in. If that's not working for you, you can also just right click the middle and click join areas and then just do that. Let's animate this logo. I'm going to go back to the solid mode. So I'm going to hit Z and then 6 because I think it's better to edit in this mode. So I'm going to turn my overlays on. With this plane selected, I want you to go into edit mode, so hit tab. That takes you into edit mode. And we're going to right click this and we're going to subdivide it. Now go over to here and we're going to give it 80 subdivisions. And this gives us lots of geometry to work with. The reason why we're doing this is because we're going to displace this object. And the way 3D works is it works on vertices. So you actually need vertices in order to mold the object. So without all of these dots and subdivisions, you wouldn't actually be able to do much with the plane in terms of sculpting it and crafting it into a different shape. But now that our plane's subdivided, we're going to go to modifiers. We're going to add a modifier and we're going to add a displace modifier. And you're going to see that's done this. I don't know why it does that, but we're going to hit plus new on this. This is going to create a new texture for us. And now it's going to bring it back down. I don't know why it does that, but it does. Hey ho. And now we want to basically add a texture to this displacement modifier. So we go to the textures here and we go to type and we're going to do clouds. Okay. And that's going to create this displacement effect on our plane. And what the displace modifier does is you're basically feeding what's called a texture, which is essentially this. It's essentially an image like this with black and white color data. And you're going to see the blacks basically mean it's going down and the whites mean it's going up. You can basically play around with this texture to essentially sculpt your object for you. That's pretty much what it does. So And we're going to use this as a sort of way to animate the logo essentially. So if you go back into your render mode and you go into camera, you'll see this animates your logo for you. But how do we drive it? Well, it's quite easy actually, because you can assign something to drive this strength value. So the strength is how much it displaces, and the texture is essentially the shape of displacement, right? And you can assign any texture to this. You can even create your own. You can import your own images if you'd like to, and even movies if you want to do that. But we're going to keep it with the clouds because it's a pretty cool look. We're going to use what's called an F-curve modifier to drive the animation of the strength. It's going to be kind of like, I'm presuming you guys come from like a music production and sort of backgrounds. It's kind of essentially like what an LFO does in a synthesizer. We're going to be using like a waveform to drive this displacement. And you can even use audio to do this as well. We're not going to do that in this tutorial, but if you wanted to, you can actually import audio and you can essentially use it to drive any animation property. We're not going to be using that, but you can imagine the potentials, right? You could have a kick, so it goes, and then you can have another object with the snare going, you get what I mean? But we're not going to be doing that in this tutorial. We're going to be using an F-curve modifier. So I'm going to take those overlays off again and go back into render mode. So Z and an 8. We're going to drag this in here and we're going to change this to the graph editor. And this basically lets you go in a bit more depth with your animation. So before I start animating though, I'm going to bring the timeline up and I want you to go over to this bit here, output properties. We're going to change the frame rate of the project to 30 frames per second. When you're doing sort of like live visuals, you really don't want to have a frame rate lower than 30 frames per second. Anything lower than 30, it just looks choppy. Obviously, the more frames, the longer the render time and the bigger the file size. So that's just one thing to bear in mind. But I would just advise to never go below 30 when you're working with live visuals. I think 24 frames per second is just a bit outdated. I think it makes sense for a movie. 30 is the way to go really when you're doing this stuff. So yeah, set your frame rate to 30 frames per second. So in order to use the F-curve modifier, we actually need to create a keyframe first. So we'll go to the displace modifier, and if you just go to the first frame of your scene, you can apply a keyframe here. I'm just going to change the end frame to 300, so that makes it a 10-second loop. So we've got 30 frames per second. So yeah, 300 frames, that would be a 10-second loop. Go to your modifier settings now, and we're going to add a keyframe on the first frame. We're going to add the keyframe on the strength value. You could manually do this, like drag it up and down, but that's a bit boring, right? I find a much better way to do stuff like this is to actually use an F-curve modifier, which is why we've got this graph editor up. So apply a keyframe to the first frame of your scene. This is important that you do that. You'll see all of this information's come up now. You wouldn't be able to see all this if you didn't add that keyframe. So that's very important. So add the keyframe to the strength of your displacement. If you can't see this menu here, you just need to press N on your keyboard. N brings that up and hides it. So N just to get this, and click on your strength displacement. And we're going to go to modifiers below F-curve, not these modifiers. It's a different kind of modifier. This is like an animation modifier. Add modifier, and we're going to use noise. And you can see this sort of works like an LFO would on a synthesizer. Apart from it's not like a traditional sine wave or saw wave. It's just noise, so it's random. You can get a sine wave. I think if you do, I think built-in function. Yeah, built-in function, you can do a sine wave, but I don't think it looks very good. I prefer the noise, so I'm going to add the noise. And this just basically pumps this parameter up and down the same way the waveform's moving, but it looks pretty crap at the moment. I want it to peak quite high and dip at least to 0. So you want to pump the strength all the way up just so it does that, but it's also way too fast. So bring that scale out just so it's like that. And if you want to bring the thing down, you can just drag it like that. You just drag the keyframe down like that. If you still don't like it, remember you can always go back to the texture, play around with the settings. So maybe give it a bit more width or even less. So it's like that. If you want it to look glitchy, you just got to give it a really small size. And remember, you can play around with these as well. You have all these different sort of styles. Just make sure when it's going up, it's not filling up the whole frame. So in order to do that, you can just drop the strength down a bit. There's also this cell noise one if you want a really glitchy look. Now I do want to go back and change the shading a bit. I'm going to add a mix node. So hit Shift A, add a mix shader. That's basically blending this into nothing. So we're going to blend these two into each other, and we're going to basically duplicate this color ramp, plug the same texture into the same color ramp, and just plug that into the fact. And this is going to give us like a nice outline. So just bring that white one up, bring the black in a bit. I think it looks a bit cooler. So I'm going to change this back to clouds. I'm going to change this back to Blender Original. And it's worth noting, the more subdivisions you have, the better the displacement will look. You can actually hit Control 2, which will add a subdivision modifier, which you can then add. You need to put that before the displacement, and that will just give you more geometry to work with. Say that you were actually bringing that size really down, that will give it a bit more resolution. So without that, it won't look as, there's just less geometry for it to displace. So you can pop that as high as your computer can handle, really. The more subdivisions, the more stress you're going to have on your computer. So you don't want to go too mad with it. I've got a pretty beefy computer, and even that's struggling, so I wouldn't have it too high. I think maybe just 1 or 2. I think 2 should be good. I'm going to go back to the graph editor, and I'm just going to bring that down a bit, just because I feel like it needs to stay undisplaced, if that's a word, for a bit longer. I think I'm going to bring the scale out as well. I think I'm going to pump up the strength a bit as well on that emission, just because now we've got the thinner lines, we can get away with a bit more bloom. So I'll give it 30 on the strength. And yeah, back to the graph editor. You'll notice that it's not looping. That's because we need these start points and end points to be at the exact same place, or it's not going to loop. So you can actually do a thing called restrict frame range, because it's not going to loop if it's displaced like at, say, 0.1 at the start, and then if it's displaced at like 0.2 at the end, it's not going to loop properly. So what you can actually do is you can restrict the frame range, and when you click that, it's basically flattened it all out, so there's no displacement now. So if you expand this menu, you can have it start at frame 1 and then end at frame 299. And we say that because we've got, it's between 1 and 300 our scene, so we want to have the displacement start at the first frame and then end at the last frame. But you don't want it to suddenly jump in, right? You want it to sort of smooth in and out, so you can just blend it in. You can blend it in by about 60 frames and then blend it out by about 60 frames as well, so that'll be about 240. So that's 240 will be when it starts to blend out, right? So that's how you can get it to loop. And I'm going to increase the strength a bit as well, so the displacement's a bit stronger. I think that looks good. I just want to increase the scale a bit as well, so it's a bit slower. But you can do this how you want, remember. Play around with these things. I quite like the glitchy looks as well with the cell noise. I think they look quite cool as well. So you can play around with that. Just do it how you want, really. I quite like it like that. And that's why I was saying you need to give yourself a bit of room to work with. If these bits start to poke out of the frame, you want to be able to scale your plane down so that it doesn't clip out of the camera. So that's pretty much it for the animation done. Because we've got these looping, you could just render out different versions with different sort of textures. So let's save one of these. Let's save this as cell noise. Right, you need to make sure, before we do this actually, we need to make sure this is at 0, right? What I was about to suggest is not going to work unless this is at 0. So let's just drag this down. Right, I've accidentally locked it, so just unclick that lock thing. I don't know how I did that, but yeah, just drag that down. This needs to be set to 0 in order to do what I said I was going to do. And what I was saying is you can so we could save multiple instances of this. The reason why I wanted it to be set to 0 was so that we can basically save different versions of this, and then we can just combine them together after in a video editor. So they have loads of different variations without making the animation scene too complex, if that makes sense. That way, if the start point and the end point are always the same, we can just basically combine the videos together, so that we haven't got to worry about doing it all in one Blender project, if that makes sense, and then making the animations a bit complicated. You can just render out multiple different 300 frame animations with different, I guess, displacement settings that we can then combine later. So we'll save this one as cell noise. Save a variation as, I don't know, cloud. Is that one called? So do that one as Blender Original. So it's a bit more wavy, see? Save another one as big cloud. We'll make this one like that. You get me? Save that. And now you can open the different ones and then do another one. We'll do this one like really small. So it's all like that. We'll call that one super glitch. And we'll do, I guess, one more. We could change this to maybe wood. Yeah, that's pretty cool, isn't it? Save that one. You could do as many as you want, really. I think I'm going to cut it there, but then all you got to do is just render out each one. In order to render out, you just need to change the output to somewhere you can find it. So I just got a little temp folder set up, so I'll just put it there. Actually, I'll probably do my and yeah, you can't see me now. I couldn't be bothered to record this again. I've probably recorded this tutorial about 3 times now already because things keep fucking up. But yeah, I'm not going to do it again. So to render out the animation, you want to go to your render properties here, your output properties. You want to change your output to somewhere you can find it. It doesn't matter where, just as long as it's somewhere you can find it. On encoding, we're going to change that to MP4. We're going to change it to H.264. Output quality, perceptually lossless. And you want to go to render and hit render animation. And now you want to do this for each project that you created. So just go ahead and open each one. Just follow the same process. Probably would have been easier to set this up before you saved them all, but hindsight's a bitch, right? So yeah, just save them all in the same place. Do that again. Go to FFmpeg video, encoding, MP4, perceptually lossless, and just render the animations. And then once you're done, you want to throw these animations into a video editor. If you've got Premiere Pro, then great. If not, if you've got like iMovie or something, or DaVinci Resolve, that's a good free one that you can download. Some might even argue it's better than Premiere Pro, so I would definitely recommend downloading that. And yeah, just throw it into DaVinci Resolve, and you can basically combine the loops together into one longer one with all these different animations. And you can even loop the same one over and over again, and then just throw in a different one every now and then. Yeah, you can do it however you want, really. That is pretty much it. So yeah. Alright guys, thank you for watching the tutorial. If you like the video, please leave a like and subscribe, and consider supporting me on Patreon. Your support helps me make this my full-time job. I'm not quite there yet, but I hope to be at some point. So yeah, if you do find value in my content, consider supporting me through there. You'll get access to all sorts of exclusive benefits. And feel free to check out my website where you can find more and more work, such as VJ loop renders, client work, and also some music I make. You can find all that at nebmotion.co.uk.